Well, last week we were looking at the entry part, and what we notice is that there's a balance in the first part of the text in how the gospel is producing faith and love, both in the world and in the believers. And Paul comes down to the end here that we might be strengthened so that we might have great endurance and patience. That always tells me that troublesome times are here, right? And then always giving thanks, that is, giving joyful thanks to the Father who's qualified us to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For, and then a reason, he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. That's where I want to pick up. Let me share my screen so you can see this.
13. Chapter 1.
And that should make it a little easier. Let me expand that out as much as I can. It's obvious to me that Paul goes into something, and I'm going to use a literary term called stuff. When you move from one stuff to another stuff, you know that you're into something different. And so you can tell just by reading this that we've landed into something else than where we were. So is this the beginning of the body? Is it still part of the prayer wish? And so this is where it's troublesome trying to figure out where the Thanksgiving prayer wish moves into the body. But what I do know is that the word son, and notice that I've colored it magenta, I think is that color. Notice that that's what he's picking up in verse 15. And I'm going to go all the way back over to the left so that we've got room to do it. But in some sense, this is further describing the Son. And maybe that's where, maybe it actually starts with the word for. Maybe the word for is the beginning of the section that we're in now. Do you guys see how that's possible? For he's rescued us from the dominion of darkness and he's brought us, notice the rhythmic kind of lines, in the Son he loves, in whom, we're going to see for in him here very quickly. And so it could be justifiable to take 13 all the way back over here. And let's see, does it link back up? No, I can't see Son before this. In fact, we don't have Son mentioned until, in fact, I think that might be the first use of the word Son. So anyway, I'm going to start all the way over to the left. And we're going to start trying to read this text very carefully there. So we've got some description here. He's in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins, big concepts. The Son is the image of the invisible God. And when I read the next line, I'm thinking it's parallel with the top. That is, if I actually was going to bring it parallel with that, I would put it right there, actually back it up a little bit. And then scoot it over to create this so you could see how the text is arranged. You see what I've done there? So image of the invisible God is one descriptor, firstborn over all creation is the other. Because I've got the word created in the next line, I'm going to indent it under the second line there. And I'm going to let the for kind of hang there so that I can see that I'm either getting results or purpose or result there with the for, or a reason or something like that's going on. And notice how this is, he's firstborn over all creation. And so this for links it with all creation here. And then in him, all things were created. You can break it down by phrase. I just break it down enough so that I can see it. And so, for in him, all things were created. And then what we have now is a breakdown of creation. Mm-hmm. Everybody good with that? You see what I'm doing there? And do you see how this line, let me do this, that this line, visible, things in heaven, and invisible, or notice that it's crisscrossed. Because things on earth will be visible, things in heaven, invisible. So it could be a potential, what we call a chiasm. The Greek letter chi looks like an X. And so sometimes in parallelism in ancient Hebrew poetry, we get items that are crisscrossed. And so basically everything so far, beginning with 4 here, is kind of really hanging on this notion of firstborn. We'll play with the notions here in a bit, and then I think I can move this one down. Let's get it out of the way. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. Does that get indented, or is it in the right place? Is it a description of things visible and invisible? Is it?
Yeah.
If it's visible and invisible, then thrones, powers, or rulers, and authority are both demonic forces and earthly forces. Which one do you think he's going for? And I think I'm tempted to indent that just one more. And I'm going to back this out to right there. And maybe you can see why I wanted to do that. Notice how it is a repeat of this line here. It's very poetically structured. And this is also what we would call a chiastic structure too, where you've got lines moving in, like things visible, things in heaven and on earth is parallel to visible and invisible. But it also makes me read thrones, powers, and authority, which I would typically read as spiritual forces, as maybe even earthly forces too, as both. Karen, you have a question there? I saw a hand go up. You're thinking something. You're still muted.
There. To me, the thrones and rulers are visible and the powers and authorities are invisible.
Okay. I'm not disagreeing that certainly could be how it stack up, because you could take all of these and begin to just pull them. You could pull them under each other so that you can see them in a stack. I'm not going to do that because So which ones do you see as visible?
Thrones and rulers.
Okay, and then powers and authorities. Hey, I'm not disagreeing that that's a possibility. It certainly would actually work well with the way the text is kind of separating visible from invisible. But notice here that all creation covers everything that's under this line. All creation. So whether it's visible or invisible, he is, whatever it means, he is the firstborn. What I find useful is just doing this kind of work with the text. Makes you try to read it in a couple of angles so that you're listening to it at a deeper level. And so, Karen, I think to determine whether or not you're right is you're going to have to see how Paul uses these words in other places and play with them a little bit there. But hey, I think it would work great. So you're seeing thrones and powers. So this is, let me do this. So is this kind of the parallelism you're seeing? Thrones and rulers are human, are visible, and powers and authorities are the invisible. Kind of works with the text. It works. Whether that's exactly what's in Paul's mind or not, we'll struggle with that, but it works. The Son is the image of the invisible God. See, do you feel the tension between visible and invisible even there? Image is something you can see, but God is invisible. And by the way, if you know the Old Testament, then you know that this could be a reflection on the Genesis account, that we were made in God's image. Very good. The word firstborn is the one that really causes a lot of consternation, because literally firstborn would be the firstborn son. So is it trying to say Jesus was born? This is where this conversation goes. Or is it an image for first in order, the first one? And one could actually understand the phrase firstborn over all creation as if he was the first creature, but that doesn't seem to be the biblical witness on who Jesus really is, because he is, after all, the image of the invisible God.
Could it possibly mean his image was created at creation? I don't know.
No, since all things were created through him, he is actually before creation.
Well, I'm saying like Jesus is before creation, but perhaps the image of him was firstborn over all creation. So maybe there's a disconnect.
Okay, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is image a way of expressing something about the humanity of Jesus, or are we going all the way back to before time and that Jesus is the image from the very beginning? Okay, fair enough. I don't know that this text answers all of those for us, but yeah, Karen, just jump in there. There's a few of us here.
Jumping down to verse 18, it says
Yeah.
he's firstborn from the dead.
Okay, that gives us, I think, some other ways. It certainly will inform our reading of what firstborn means. So,
Could it mean the firstborn over all creation because he was also son of man, that he was literally the firstborn over all of creation? Like,
yeah,
authority?
let's wait until we get to the other phrase that Karen's already brought up. But I think it's fair to struggle with it. And folks who end up with some pretty odd views, some of them were really struggling with how to understand this. And so what do you do? Let's go back to the structure of the text. Where does verse 17 ride in this collection of lines? Is it a repeat of, let me just back up one. Is it kind of a repeat of this and an expansion of that? I think it could still hold together under the firstborn of all creation, that's still kind of the lead line for it. And I'm wondering if the and hooks together the ideas. Is this new material, or is it balanced material with what we've already seen? And what I'm asking is, the further left we have it, the more primary we think it is for the case that the author's making. So I'm kind of happy with where it is for the most part here. Let's see if we can't begin to separate some of these descriptors. So obviously that's a new line. And we can indent so that. Remember, we always indent so that because it's going to bring us. And then that 4 is going to cause me to want to put it somewhere, right? 4 is always one of those words that we want to watch because it gives us rationale or reason. Let's see if it helps us read the text, Andy. Okay, so he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I hear this as kind of a cosmic thing, kind of a, maybe all creation is all things and all things together is creation. And then I'm sensing in verse 18 that head of the body is big and important, but it's not the same thing as the cosmic thing. It's a different focus. What do you guys think?
Can I ask you a question? Just maybe
Yeah.
it will help
Well,
me
you're the
understand.
you're the host. You're not supposed to have questions. You're supposed to field questions.
I
My
know,
bad.
right? I always forget. Okay. So why would you not, I'm just asking,
Sure.
why would you not put he is before all things aligned with the firstborn over all creation? Like, is that not the same kind of idea? Like, why wouldn't you indent it one more to the left? I mean, whatever,
So
the other way.
yeah. So would you do this? And
Stan?
what you're feeling is a sense of parallelism with this phrase, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, Karen.
And now you've moved it, and I've got to get it straight in my mind again. I was saying the firstborn over all creation, and in him all things were created, verse 15 and 16, as being paralleled, firstborn over all creation, all things have been created through him and for him. In him all things were created. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That line with in him all things were created.
So you're saying something like this maybe a little more makes it a little clearer to you?
Well, except the in him all things were created needs to be over parallel. So those four things. Verse 16,
Okay.
back one more to the left.
That one there. In him all things were created.
Back one more to the left.
This one.
Firstborn over all creation, all things have been created through him and for him. In him all things were created. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I don't know. There's other ways to do it.
Yeah. There's a bit of an artistic way of doing it. The important thing is it's causing us to read the text. And the one thing that it is helping us with is there's a rich repeating that's going through this material. And that's what we want to see, is that rich repeating, because the thing the author is saying over and over again is something that the author wants you to see. And so I don't disagree that that's a possibility. At the end of the day, if it helps us just read the text a little more clearly, then we've done our work. And so the finished product is not so much what's on the page, but what's in our understanding as we read the text.
What's needed here is multiple screens so I can keep track of the text and of what you're doing.
I've got two screens myself here making this work, so I hope you can see it. Where does the so that does it see? Here's what's interesting here is the so that can actually depend on all of these lines. It doesn't have to depend on just the last line. Because it would seem to me that all of these lines are leading to the so that in everything he might have the supremacy, which kind of tells us that all of the lines before is about how important supremacy, how important Jesus is, the Son.
Yeah, for me, I feel like that can almost be all the way to the left, and then the first indent being in everything he might have supremacy just kind of captures everything above it, basically.
Yeah. Just because it's to the right doesn't mean it's less important. It just means it's a supporting point as opposed to being a point. That's kind of what we're working on there. Okay, now let's say 4. Does the 4, which we can do, go back to here, hanging on all of the things that have gone before, or is the so that tied to just this line, and so the 4 is under this? Is the 4 tied to he might have the supremacy, or does it really matter given the fact that all of the information above is about the supreme position of Christ? I generally leave it here, but I recognize that it can tie to the, again, this stuff, and Karen mentioned this last week, there's a real potential that this is a early Christian hymn that Paul's modified to create text, because it's got such a rhythmic quality to it. In fact, if it's not a song, we ought to turn it into one. So.
Just a comment, Stan, that there's,
Sure.
at least in the English, like verses 15 and in 17 and even part of 18 seem to go like the Son is, and then He is in verse 17, and verse 18, He is again, and then the head of the body, He is the beginning and
Oh,
the firstborn.
yeah.
It's almost like
Yeah,
those could all be lined up evenly on the left side.
sure, sure. Yeah, I don't, in fact, that's why you need more colors than I'm using here. I don't want to color it up, but I would take all of those repetitious phrases and I would give them coloring so that I could see them. It's certainly a declaration of who the Son is. And one of the rhetorical questions we want to ask is, why does Paul, at the very beginning of this letter, want to set straight this fact that Jesus has the supremacy? I think it's going to play into what Paul's going to do in chapter 2 and 3 of this particular letter. So that's the bigger question, is not just what does this say, but what is it doing in regards to what comes next? And by the way, the 4 here gives us a doozy of a line. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. I'm going to naturally just take the and do it like that to connect those thoughts. Through him to reconcile to himself all things. By the way, see how it connects with what's already been said before? I might even do this one here like this, that the all things, might even indent it over so that it's under the all things. Because to reconcile to himself all things by making peace through his blood is the means by which he does the reconciliation. Shed on the cross, of course, is just a descriptor for an important descriptor, but a descriptor of the blood. So let's play with thoughts here. I think everything above this line basically points to the supremacy of Christ. I think we're good with that, right? Both cosmic and in the church. There's 2 there, right? There's kind of 2 arenas that he might have the supremacy for. You think that means because or towards the end of? Which direction is that for going? Is that giving the reason for everything above? Because for can sometimes just be what's translated for here can also be because. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. What's trying to be expressed here, you think?
That he was God?
Yes, but I think even more so, I think it's moving in the direction that all the fullness of God's deity existed in him as a human. I only know that because I know the rest of the letter, but at this point, it's a really interesting phrase to ponder, because he is the image of the invisible God, and God was pleased to have all of God's fullness, whatever that means, to live in him. And it's present tense, so it makes you wonder whether or not the pleased is past tense, but the dwelling is present. Well, one's wondering, does that mean continuing to dwell in him? And notice that reconciliation here is a much bigger project than just saving people.
Just going back to that comment, God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. I'm wondering if that's kind of in his human life, that God was on display through Jesus.
Yeah, certainly that's true. But I appreciate you guys are recognizing how odd this language might be the first time you hear it. I know you've heard it before, but to actually ponder it and think what it means. And that somehow this reconciliation thing is cosmic in nature, which I think is pretty cool, because I think generally within evangelical circles, we think of salvation as personal insurance. And I don't want to disagree with that concept. I just think it's much bigger.
I appreciate your comments on that, because that clause always puzzled me, is what was there in heaven that needed to be reconciled to Jesus?
Well, that's if he's using the word the same way that heavenly realms is used in Ephesians, and of course the heavenly realms are where the spiritual battle takes place, as well as where the spiritual blessings are.
Yeah.
And so it's not our typical way of using the word heaven. I think heaven is the counterpart to visible and invisible, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Heavenly might be the better way, but no, you're reading it carefully. But notice back at the bottom of the last section, we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins, which has to deal with individuals. And in this particular piece of the material ends with the notion that reconciliation also has a cosmic dimension to it, and that making peace is another way of saying reconciliation, but he does it through his blood on the cross, that Jesus's death on the cross did more than just ensure personal salvation to individuals. There's a much bigger picture. And so we find that the New Testament, when it does eschatology, it doesn't think of us going to heaven as much as new heavens and new earth, as new possibilities that God's going to do for us in the future. And so it picks up on the language of Isaiah and others that there's going to be a new reality. I try not to be too definitive in the new reality, because I think we're given images as opposed to exact blueprints on how that thing's going to look, whatever it is. One of the things that we noticed last week, and I think in all fairness, we ought to notice it this week, this is pretty dense and thick. And it requires something of a background. Let's go back to the notion of he is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead. Now, I don't know if beginning ought to be, let me go ahead and move this down one just so that we can see the two images. And then I would. So is it saying he is the beginning from among the dead, or he's the beginning, semi-stop, and also the firstborn from among the dead? Notice it could be applied to both. And that's the purpose of doing this, so that we look at it and we read it carefully. But
I definitely like the "and also" idea.
So you're thinking he's the beginning from among the dead? Is it a proper way to read the text?
No, I'm
He's the
thinking
beginning.
that his beginning is one point, and another point is he is also the firstborn from among the dead.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I think that's probably the right way to do it, is that he is the beginning, picking up on the language of Genesis maybe. And firstborn among the dead makes a lot more sense here, because it doesn't mean, what it means is that he's the first one to rise from the dead. Firstborn implies there are others coming.
I think in history, as far as I know, Jesus was not the first to be raised from dead. Okay.
That's right.
But
Good point.
however, if the Bible said that he's the firstborn, but he's only the first one to raise from the dead, but without dying again.
Fair enough, Raymond. I think you're absolutely onto what this image is about. Yeah. But I do want you to hear, in the notion of firstborn, is that there's brothers and sisters involved here. I think that's built into the thought too. The language actually comes out of the Old Testament, and it literally starts with the firstborn, who is a privileged child. What's interesting is that Isaac is not the firstborn of Abraham, but he's treated as if, and he's called in Genesis 22, your only child, which I think is the language that gets picked up in the New Testament that used to be translated only begotten. But I think only kind is probably the right way to translate it because it reflects the language that the Greek translation used to translate that concept in Hebrew, which was unique son, only son. Wow. Let's try to make sense of the next paragraph then. You guys ready? Listen, I know there's lots of questions. What we're trying to do here is just get a sense of how to read this text and how to read it carefully. Once you were alienated from God, do you see the connection with the previous text at all? Alienation is the opposite of peace. It's the opposite of reconciliation. So there is a logical connection why we moved from verse 20 to 21. So once you were alienated, and I think we can move this, and we're enemies. That's another way of saying that. And if you want to, you can do this. Again, because is one of those words that helps us create a transition.
Should be because of.
Oh, you are absolutely right. If I can spell. Yeah. So in this text, we are alienated from God, not for cosmic reasons, but for our evil behavior. What does the but contrast with? And I'm going to take the but now because they're both kind of transitional words that move us to the next.
As opposed to the once in verse 21.
Ah, very good. Everybody see that? Once we were alienated, but now the now is actually the contrast with the once. Jenna, I love it when you see it because I can tell because of your eyes that you get this, you see it. But now, good. And I'm going to move this back over a little bit more because I think it's actually more important. I think all of this actually sets up what he wants to say in 22.
Mm-hmm.
He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. And let me pull this out of our way so that we can actually try to make sense of this. Well, I think we can bring this down. Boy, that's a lot to put in that line, isn't it? Where would you like to break it at all? I mean, we could break it down to, let's break it down right there.
I also broke it at by Christ's physical body through death.
Sure. Yeah, he reconciled you. That's the means, and I would indent that. But I'm actually going to leave the present you holy in his sight because it ties to basically why did he reconcile you? It answers that part of it. He reconciled you to present you holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. I also think it's interesting that the last line here is free from blemish and or without blemish and free from accusation. And the last line here is because of your evil behavior. So your evil behavior is canceled out. Also, the connection I would make here is that making peace through his blood shed on the cross is echoed here by Christ's physical body through death. That is death on the cross. But notice that the outcome here, I would actually take this little statement and do something like that to remind us that all of this work is going to create a situation in which we can be presented in his sight as holy. And then without blemish and free from accusation is actually kind of an expansion of the word holy, wouldn't you say?
So then could you line those two up if you wanted to present you holy and without blemish and free from accusation? Can you align those? Like if we
Well,
wanted?
Which one would you move, Jana?
Well, I would put like to present you holy. I see, I would, but I'm not saying that I know, obviously, because I don't.
Oh,
But I would put to present you holy under your evil behavior because it's the antithesis of that. And then align without blemish right underneath it. So like to present you holy, aligned with your evil behavior, and then without blemish, aligned with to present you holy. But
okay. But Jana, you're doing exactly the process that I think we ought to do, because it causes us to read back and forth in the text to see how they're connected. Again, I like it when it looks pretty on paper, but that's probably not the most important thing but we're actually struggling with what these lines are trying to communicate to us. So what does Paul believe happened at the cross? Something that has both cosmic significance, but something that also has personal significance. They're both true. And so reading the text carefully can, I think, keep us from some simple either or categories that are a bit more both and. Okay, we've got a bit of a shift here. The word if is fun, isn't it? By the way, the word if can sometimes be translated since, and sometimes with Greek, you can't tell which one is the right one. And so since tends to talk about a current reality. If is a little more future oriented, and if it's a condition. So what is true if you continue your faith? What is true in the earlier text? Because it's linked. Again, this is the beauty of doing this, is because texts are not isolated from one another. They're actually connected to each other. What remains true if you continue in your faith?
You're reconciled.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. And we will struggle with whether it is a since or an if, but I think the way it's framed here, this also shows you that Paul's beginning to move towards some of his concern. So I'm taking the if as conditional and not in the way that the word since would be read. I'm just telling you that in Greek, the word can be translated either depending on the context. Okay, I'm going to put established in your faith as a descriptor of the word faith. And I think this next little clause will tell us that if is in fact the right way to read this thing. You see why I'm going in that direction? And let me move that over to, because it's really hanging on that you again. And I'm going to push this all the way over here under gospel, because it's obviously picking up that. So verse 23, if you continue in your faith, would seem to be equivalent to, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. So when you hear that line, you hear that Paul is concerned about something. Now, it might be something that he would normally say in everyday teaching just to help people stay faithful, but It also might be that he's beginning to move us towards, perhaps there's some concern that these folks might step away from faith, that they might move away. Any other comments? I mean, I feel like I'm doing most of the talking, but you guys are, I can tell in your face that you're really thinking this out. So this is encouraging. Those of you that I can see.
Yeah, I was inclined to kind of move that "this is the gospel" phrase away from the rest of it, as if he was broaching
Sure.
a new topic.
Well, that's it. But notice, of course, that it is, again, this is the beauty of scripture, is that often it will be connected with what went previously, even if we move this all the way over as kind of the header of a new topic, which we can do.
I wonder one thing, the verse 23, can I have, if you being the, top, continue in your faith as one point, establish and firm as number 2, and third is, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel.
Okay.
Does it make it clearer, that for the reading?
And you want,
Establish and firm is parallel to, continue in your faith, and then do not move. It's the 3.
okay.
I think established and firms describes your faith.
Maybe, yeah. But I do appreciate what you're seeing, Raymond. Whether you see 2 or 3 items there, essentially together they say the same thing: stay faithful. Yeah.
Yes.
I tend to read the same way Karen does, but again, if you were doing this for yourself, if you did this, you would still be able to see the point of the text.
Because
So-
it has to do with the reconciliations. Yeah. But
That's
sure,
right.
I have no problem, it's under, established and firm under faith, but that I
Yeah,
wonder whether there could be an alternative way of reading.
Sure. Again, when you're doing this kind of work, you want to play with every kind of, if you think something's possible, move it around and see if it makes more sense to you. One of the challenges we have is Greek is a language that can contain very long sentences with lots of thoughts, lots of subordinate clauses, lots of weight. English is not so friendly to it. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure what I find that happens when we do this kind of work is that we actually, even though we're working from English, we still have a chance to hear the nuance of the text. That the Greek text, listen, a Greek text can throw down an adjective and you can say, does it go with this word or does it go with that word? And you can say yes. English, not so much. So. I'm wondering how established and firm actually kind of at least conceptually with the notion of the hope that's held out in the gospel. See, so there's kind of it's not not kind of a language connection. It's just a conceptual connection that hope is certain. So, but anyway.
Well, I think with the word "and," you have established and not moving, or firm and not moving. It seems to be the same concept in both.
Yeah, exactly. And so Paul is saying now you're reconciled to Christ, and the if is functioning as a way of saying, but stay in that relationship, stay there, don't move. Okay, Bill, I want you to tell me how this line here functions as a new topic. I see it as describing the gospel that's already been mentioned, but
Well, it certainly ties in,
Yeah, fair enough.
but it doesn't seem to be part of the salvation stuff he was just talking about.
Mm,
It seems to be, and now I want to get on to something else.
okay, fair enough. And that something else happens to be himself.
Yeah.
So he wants to say this so that he can say what's next. But notice that we've got another example of one thought unit being connected to the next thought unit by kind of a logical connection. You guys want to do one more section? You got it in you? Need to stretch?
We just letting in here, we have got an Ash Wednesday service coming on in
Okay.
about 5 minutes. So we'll stick around for a few minutes and then we'll.
Okay,
Say bye.
Graham, it's good to see you guys. Thanks for joining us tonight.
I was wondering in that last sentence we alluded to, this is the gospel that you have heard, when he says proclaim to every creature under heaven.
Uh-huh.
Is that more the continuing of that theme of cosmic?
I think so. And it's interesting because second century Christians are actually reading this to say that the mission actually made it to every creature. But I think Paul's being hyperbolic here. I think he's exaggerating a little bit here, but it could be that he's using the language that is above. You know, the prophets will sometimes speak as something's true because it's so certain it will be true. So I don't know if Paul's doing one of those numbers or not. So, but it is clear that Paul wants to get to the place of he's become a servant of the gospel. And remember, the gospel, the theme of the gospel takes us all the way back to that first section because the gospel is bearing fruit. It's creating faith and love in all the world and within people. So I'll tell you what I'll do. Let's just kind of dive into the, I'm not going to do the flow stuff in verse 24, but I want you to hear verse 24 to kind of intrigue us, and we'll come back to it next week because this is one of the most fascinating texts in the New Testament as far as I'm concerned. Now I rejoice in what I'm suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regards to Christ's affliction for the sake of his body, which is the church. Tell me that doesn't slow you down a bit to say, what? I've become its servant, again, echoing what he's already said, by the commission God gave me to present you the word of God in its fullness. There's the word fullness again, maybe a theme for us as we're watching. The mystery that, by the way, kind of renaming the fullness, the mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. So Paul's got this notion of a mystery, something that was hidden, but something now revealed. To them, the Lord's people, the saints, to them God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory.